the UK is a poor country with some rich people in it. Now, I know that can sound absurd to even say, but that's the basis of this article here in the Financial Times. And this got me thinking that the UK is simultaneously the 6th largest economy in the world, but that a third of all children in the UK live in poverty, that the UK has a GDP per capita that puts it in the top 20 countries worldwide, but a survey in 2022 by Shelter found that nearly 40% of UK households are one paycheck away from homelessness. So in this video, I want to examine this claim, looking at what the data says and where it all went wrong. London has a GDP of well over £500 billion per year, equivalent to about 650 billion US dollars, which on its own is a very, very respectable number. If it were a country, then it would be just here on global rankings, somewhere between Belgium and Sweden. It can literally compete with developed and wealthy nation states. But this is one of the first things that the article points out. What would the rest of the UK look like if you excluded London? Well, without London, the GDP per capita of the UK would be less than the poorest state in the US, Mississippi. But how can we think about this visually, and what does this really mean? But when you look at international comparisons, like in this diagram here, the picture for the UK gets pretty bleak. So in blue for each country, we have the average GDP per capita for the US, the UK, Germany and Netherlands, which you can see just here. And then in red for each country, we have what happens to the GDP per person if you exclude the richest region of that country. And the results are pretty startling. The gap between the two lines in Germany and the Netherlands is pretty close. That is to say that even if you remove the richest region of their economies, that doesn't have a dramatic reduction in GDP. Or alternatively, you could say that there is not as much geographical inequality between regions in both countries. The US gap is slightly bigger, but the UK gap is biggest of all, and that means that the UK falls woefully short of where you might expect. This is also how, when you exclude London, the UK is poorer than Mississippi, shown by this line just here. This basically tells us that the UK economy is very, very London-centric, and when London sneezes, the rest of the UK economy catches a cold. As we've mentioned, the GDP of London is absolutely gigantic. It would be a top-tier economy in its own right. But London is also the richest region in Northern Europe. And at this point, the data doesn't seem all that surprising given the data that we've already looked at so far. But how does the rest of the UK fare when we look at the poorest regions in Northern Europe? Well, let's take a look. If you look at all the poorest regions in Northern Europe, the UK has 9 of the 10, and what this really means is that great swathes of the UK are not that much better off than a middle-income country in Eastern Europe like Poland. And the piece in the FT makes this same exact point, saying, quote, in 2007, the average UK household was 8% worse off than its peers in Northwestern Europe. But the deficit has since ballooned to a record 20%. On present trends, the average Slovenian household will be better off than its British counterpart by 2024, and the average Polish family will move ahead before the end of the decade. And there's reams of data to back this up. Take a look at this graph here. You can see the UK in dark green. This shows that taking 2010 as a baseline, the UK growth has just gone absolutely nowhere, losing out only to France and Italy. And this has a real impact on people's personal finances. UK workers are on average £14,000 worse off per year in real terms now than if earnings had continued to rise at pre-2008 rates after the crash. I think we're starting to really build a picture of what the article is talking about, why the UK is a poor country with some very rich people in it, but there's still more to get through. At the same time as wages are absolutely flatlining, the prices of assets are going up and have started to really pick up speed. By 2023, the wealth of the 50 richest families in the UK was equal to half the wealth of the entire British population. This is another thing that the FT article covers, saying, quote, starting at the top of the ladder, Britons enjoy very high living standards by virtually any benchmark. Last year, the top earning 3% of UK households each took home about £84,000 after tax. This puts Britain's highest earners narrowly behind the wealthiest Germans and Norwegians and comfortably among the global elite. So what happens when we move down the rungs? While top earners rank 5th, the average UK household ranks 12th, and the poorest 5% ranked 15th. Last year, the lowest earning bracket of British households had a standard of living that was 20% weaker than their counterparts in Slovenia. But how did we get here? What were the main driving forces that have meant that the average UK citizen is now so much worse off than they were even 10 years ago? And why the UK is well on its way to potentially being a poor country were it not for London? Well, we can chalk it up to a few main things, which we'll discuss now. But the first really is low pay. We've discussed in a little bit of detail the consequences of the UK's poor economic performance and how that has had devastating consequences on real household income. This has been likened to Japan's lost decade, but for the international view, in 2007 the average British household was 8% less prosperous than those in Norway and 6 behind the US. But in the years since the financial crisis, this has grown substantially. Now British households sit 20% behind Norway and 16% behind the US. And one of the main drivers of this extremely poor wage growth has been weak productivity. So take a look at this here. The pink line shows trend productivity growth for the UK, and wages are tied very tightly to productivity, but more on that in a second. But you can see here that from 1990 to 2007, this meant average productivity growth was 2%. But after the financial crisis, productivity completely, for the next decade, the average growth is 0.6%. Had productivity carried on growing at the same rate, it would have been about 25% higher than it is now. Now we talked about the relationship between wages and productivity. We can see in this graph that wages follow productivity. As workers become more productive, their wages go up because they're able to make more in a fixed time period. This means their employer is making more and so can afford to pay them more, and so on and so on. In fact, UK productivity is about 20% below the US and lags well below the G7 average. And all this was made even more frustrating given that we had record low interest rates. So in response to the financial crisis, interest rates were slashed. The idea was to try and free up money in the banks that were distressed in order to kickstart the economy. By making cheap money available, banks could go out and lend it to people and businesses could go and spend and invest in the economy. The problem is that savers were basically getting absolutely nothing for their savings account. So what do? They go out and invest that money, which drives up the price of assets like housing and equities. This means that people who own assets, generally the wealthiest people who have spare money to buy more assets, see the value of their assets increase over time at an increased rate. This is compared to those people who don't own any assets. And this is all borne out by the data. Take a look at this here. In 2023, the top 1% owned 54% of equity markets in the US. And low interest rates led us to our next important point, which is housing costs. Another really big factor that weighs on most people in the UK is the access to housing, or more importantly, affordable housing. We've just talked about the effect that low interest rates had on equity, but this also had a spillover effect into UK housing. In 1976, the price to household income ratio was about 2.64, rising to 4.44 by 1999, and accelerating to 8.6 times earnings by 2023. And when you compare the cost of UK housing internationally, the picture is extremely dire. Our next cause for why the UK is a poor country with some rich people in is low investment. We'll start with public investment, because, again, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the UK was highly indebted, and it had been for a while, but it's also worth noting it's nothing by today's indebtedness standards, but more on that a bit later. The thinking at the time was pretty simple. The idea was that the UK had to cut spending in order to avoid economic oblivion. Everything had a target on it. Public transport, defence spending, policing, schools, the NHS, nothing was off limits seemingly. This led to a whole plethora of bad economic outcomes, not to mention forcing things like food bank use to absolutely skyrocket. And this is the problem, that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, UK households and businesses assessed, kind of correctly I might add, that they were too indebted and that they needed to do the responsible thing and reduce their debt burden. But the problem is, if the government gets in on the same game, then where is the growth going to come from in the UK? The three main players in any economy are private businesses, private households, and the government. If all three are cutting, where's the growth? And at this stage, this has been researched extensively. Take a look at this study here. A study published by the Centre for Economic Policy Research analysed data from 29 advanced economies and found that austerity policies negatively impacted economic performance by reducing GDP, inflation, consumption, and investment. The study concluded that efforts to reduce debt through austerity during the depths of the economic recession were counterproductive. But there's also another follow-up crime here, which I think doesn't get anything like the attention it should. The real crime here is that there was such a lack of public investment when the government could borrow so cheaply, virtually the cheapest money in history. And this wasn't viewed as a good time to borrow money to make the UK economy more productive. And this kind of shines through in other parts of the economy. When you look at how the UK fares when it comes to access for high-speed internet, for example, as of March 2024, the UK ranks 35th globally in fixed broadband internet speed. The final thing we should probably look at is the tax system. That the rates for people who earn their income from capital are about half the rates when compared to the rates that people pay on income from labour. Now, who owns assets? People who have more money and therefore have more assets. This is one of the primary driving forces behind why the rich in the UK have done so well. Owning a home in the London or the South East over the last 20 years has been an extremely profitable endeavour, with some parts of London seeing truly phenomenal house price growth. And just think about this for a moment. After the financial crisis, the UK had low investment, which we've discussed. This low investment meant that worker productivity went absolutely nowhere for basically a decade. which meant that wages have stagnated. But at the same time, low interest rates have meant that the same housing has never been more expensive. Equities have been on an absolute tear for well over a decade. And when it comes to taxes, people who earn their income through labour are taxed at a lower rate than people who own assets and earn their income through capital or ownership. So in a nutshell, if you really wanted to answer the question that we started with, why is the UK a poor economy with some rich people in it? That right there is how we got here. But there's an interesting follow-up question, which is, how does this inequality affect the UK economy? Now, it can seem a bit theoretical and abstract, so I wanted to go through some tangible explanations and examples about why rising inequality has absolutely hammered the UK economy so much. The first thing is reduced consumer demand. When wealth is concentrated at the top, a large portion of the population has less disposable income, since lower and middle income households tend to spend a larger share of their income as a proportion of their wealth. This is known as the marginal propensity to consume. Someone who's on a lower income might spend, say, 50% of their income on housing and other needs, but someone who's worth millions or billions isn't spending that kind of money every single year on their housing costs. And it's also this high inequality that leads to weaker overall demand in the economy, slowing down business growth and creating fewer jobs. Next up is lower human capital development. In highly unequal societies, access to quality education and healthcare can be limited to only those who can afford it. Think about it. Eton, Harrow, and the overrepresentation of privately educated students who go to Oxford or Cambridge is typically around the 30% mark. But when you compare that to the number of people who are privately educated in the UK, which is more like 6 or 7%, never mind the fact that a recent study found that students who are privately educated now have almost no academic advantage when they're compared to their state school counterparts. Take a look at this. Pupils in England who attend fee-paying schools no longer outperform their state peers in core GCSEs once results are adjusted for socio-economic background, according to a new study. An inefficient use of resources. Now, when you have a society that lacks upward social mobility, it means you don't necessarily get the best people in the best jobs. You get the people who can afford to be in those jobs. This is the case in the world of finance or the creative world. And here's what I mean. Pretty much every single well-known actor or actress currently in movies that is from the UK were invariably, what you find is they were privately educated. Tom Hiddleston went to Windlesham House School. Tom Hardy went to Damian Lewis went to Eton. Natalie Emmanuel went to St Hilda's. Joseph Quinn went to Emmanuel. Vanessa Kirby went to Lady Eleanor School. Tel Ejiofor went to Dulwich Prep. Benedict Cumberbatch went to Harrow. Now, I don't have anything against these people. They are indeed some of the best and brightest actors and actresses out there. And I'm not trying to make a broader point that there may well be fantastic actors and actresses who didn't go to private school. But when you have some industries or jobs that have high barriers to entry, especially economic barriers, then that's not necessarily the best use of resources. And then now I get it. Whilst this can seem like a trivial Hollywood point, it does lead to an inefficient allocation of resources, lower long-term growth. Empirical research, including studies by the IMF and the OECD, has shown consistently that high inequality tends to reduce economic growth over time. We have this study here from the Centre for Economic Policy Research, which found that increases in income inequality reduced GDP per capita. That on average, a 1 percentage point increase in the Gini coefficient reduces GDP per capita by around 1.1% over a 5-year period. Then we have this study here from the Economic Policy Institute, which found that rising inequality has slowed growth in aggregate demand by 2 to 4 percentage points of GDP annually in recent years. And here's the thing, when wealth is more evenly distributed, more people can contribute productively to the economy, leading to more sustainable long-term growth. But it also allows for a boost in domestic demand. Think about it. How many people in the UK can actually afford to buy a Bentley or an Aston Martin or a Rolls-Royce engine? The final thing is an over-reliance on debt. So when we have a situation where wages stagnate, as they have done for most people, but the cost of living rises, households have to rely on more debt in order to maintain a standard of living. This causes a level of financial instability that we discussed right at the start of the video. Because this increases overall indebtedness, it means that people are less likely to go out and start a business or take on a more high-risk venture because they have personal debts that need to be serviced, not least of all student debt. So what does all this tell us? That the UK economy is highly dependent on London for its prosperity, but that the wealth that London generates often doesn't flow outwards to other parts of the UK that have been increasingly left behind. But here's the thing. Being a rich country on paper doesn't mean much if most people don't feel it. We also have this video here about how the UK tax system is designed to stop you building wealth. And we have this video just here about how you can copy investing tips from the top 0.02% of investors in the UK. Thanks very much for watching. Subscribe and comment below if you think I've missed anything.